I want you to take a moment and think about your life. Think about every person that you know and every person that you've ever met. Now imagine one out of three of those people dies. Now, this is an unrealistic thing to imagine, and it's an almost unreal reality to fathom. But for the people of 14th century Europe, this was reality. Today, we're going to be talking about the Black Plague. Welcome back to the Average Guy Explains YouTube channel, your one-stop place for all the knowledge in the world that you did not need, taught to you by a guy who is definitely not qualified to teach you about it. The Black Plague, the Black Death, the Bubonic Plague. These are all names given to a pandemic that swept across 14th century Europe and killed quite a lot of people. But what is the Black Plague and how did it come to be? Today we're going to take a little dive into the flea-ridden and rat-infested history of the Black Plague. So grab a drink, sit back, and maybe I'll teach you something. First things first, we got to go back in time to 1347, when some Genoese traders returned from the Black Sea and landed in Italy. They brought all kinds of goods from the Far East, but they also brought something with them that was a little more spicy. See, they brought rats with them, and aboard those rats was death itself. You see, the rats were infested with fleas, and those fleas carried a very specific bacteria, which I'm going to butcher the scientific name of, but I believe it is pronounced Yersinia pestis, aka the Black Plague. And this bacteria was going to prove to be way more viral than any of the dumbest TikTok trends you've ever seen. You see, the fleas, much like people at an all-you-can-eat buffet, just kept on munching on those rats, so the rats died. Well, then the fleas moved on to a larger mammal, human beings. This is how many experts believe that the Black Plague was transmitted to human beings. And once that transmission had started, the writing was on the wall for one of the deadliest pandemics in all of human history. Now, before we go any further, we have to take a look at 14th century Europe to really understand how this plague spread across almost all of Europe. You see, hygiene, waste disposal, and cleanliness were not really things that people paid attention to. These were agrarian communities, and most people bathed like once a month. There were religious figures back then that were preaching about how bathing was sinful, and most families would bathe very sparingly, and every single person in the entire household will use the same bath water. You mix that in with animals in the street, no sewage systems, no plumbing systems, and I mean, you really have a nasty, nasty town or village. This is a breeding ground for rats, and as we previously discussed, those rats are infested with fleas that are carrying the bubonic plague. So you mix the nastiest human beings ever living in a tight-knit, community-driven town. I mean, everyone went to the same church. Everybody went to the same bakery. I mean, these people are living shoulder to shoulder. And now you have plague fleas in their town, and those fleas are infecting every single person in the town. And by the time anyone really noticed what was going on, it was far too late to stop it. Once infected, the plague would manifest itself into three distinct types. You had pneumonic plague, septicemic plague, and bubonic plague. Now, all three of these are fatal if left untreated, and just a little editor's note for you, there wasn't no treatment. It was not available at this time in history. Not that it stopped anybody from trying, but I digress. We'll get more into that later. So pneumonic plague, as the name suggests, is an infection of the lungs, and as the name also hints at, it would lead to the development of pneumonia. So you've got a bunch of people that are coughing up highly contagious fluids, including a little bit of blood in there for you. So that's very contagious to other people. Then you've got septicemic plague, which is an infection of the blood. This, like pneumonic plague, would manifest flu-like symptoms, as well as nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, often including a little bit of blood in there for you. Would also lead to the development of blood clots, organ failure, and the development of necrotic or dead tissue in your extremities. Then you had bubonic plague, which, just like the previous two, also included flu-like symptoms, but you would also develop black swollen lymph nodes all over your body. They look like little black cysts. And they contained a highly contagious fluid, and they would also occasionally pop. These were called buboes, i.e., the name bubonic plague. Buboes, it's the little things all over your body. So, pretty much once you were infected, you were just a walking contagion for the rest of society until your eventual death, which was typically about 10 days after the original infection. As the plague began to take hold all over Europe, there was a lot of theories on how to treat it. Now, of course, none of these actually worked, and they would just lead to unnecessary misery for the infected person, but they included bloodletting, leeching, rebalancing of the humors, amputation of infected limbs. None of this worked, and the infected person would still die, but this also helped continue to spread the disease, and eventually entire towns would die off. Every single person in a town or village would become infected and die. This led to some radical theories on where the plague even came from. People thought it was the divine judgment from God. People also blamed the Jews for it. They thought that the Jewish people had poisoned the water supply, and there was even massacres during this time of Jewish villages because they were getting blamed once again for something that they did not do. And as the plague continued to spread, town after town after town of people just died off. The question became not if you were going to catch the plague, it was just when you were going to catch it. Fun fact, the infamous plague doctor mask, see up here, big bird beak mask thing, wasn't just a radical fashion idea, but there was actually some thought and design behind them. You see, people were convinced that the plague was spread through bad smells because towns that were infected with the plague smelled bad. Now, it's probably because of the mounting pile of bodies from all the dead people, but I digress. So inside the beak of the plague doctor mask, they would put flowers and herbs and perfumes and things that smell good because they thought that that would keep the plague out. Now, of course, this is not true at all, but it did inadvertently help a little bit because while you were helping your infected and leaky patients, your face was covered. So, as a, happy little byproduct, it kind of helped. The plague would continue to ravage its way through Europe and infect almost every single country. The death toll is estimated anywhere from 25 to 200 million people. This number's unknown because A, nobody lived long enough to count the bodies, and B, they didn't really do censuses back then, so nobody really knows how many people there even were. But it's estimated to be about a third to half of Europe's entire population was killed off. I mean, you're talking entire towns of people just gone. While there were actually some isolated communities that didn't do trade and communicate with outside people, think like modern day Amish people, that were unaffected by the plague at all. Now, this, of course, led to devastating impacts on the economy and trade. But there was a positive note to it. Essential jobs saw a drastic wage increase because, A, if you're the only blacksmith or baker for 50 miles because all the other blacksmiths and bakers died, you could kind of charge what you wanted to charge for stuff because, hey, they need you more than you need them. This also led to land being available for sale that had been previously owned by large families, as well as the development of some of the initial thoughts on quarantining. People really didn't want this to happen again. Now, this entire thing all occurred just over 7 years, with the plague finally beginning to die off in 1353. Fun fact, the word quarantine comes from the Italian word quarantino, which means 40 in Italian. This is because towns began implementing quarantine procedures to prevent the plague from ever happening again. What they would do is, if you were a new person coming to a town, they would force you into isolation for about 40 days so they could keep an eye on you because they didn't want you bringing any new diseases into their settlement. So after your quarantine was up, they would then allow you to integrate into whatever town or village you were trying to join. The Black Plague is still around to this day and has had many reoccurrences throughout all of human history. Although with modern hygiene practices and waste disposal, we've pretty much all but eradicated it. The last big occurrence of it being in the early 1900s in San Francisco, California. So, if you were to catch the plague today, just take some antibiotics and you'll be fine. So, if you see a rat scurrying in the street, no need to go running away because you think you're going to catch something and make your arms fall off. But I think this about wraps up our video on the Black Plague. I hope you learned something. If you did, let me know in the comments. If you didn't, then well, congratulations. You're obviously smarter than me. Not a high bar to pass. But as usual, I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to watch these videos. Please subscribe if you haven't. Leave me a like on the video. Comment suggestions for further videos. And until then, I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.